A cleaning lady approached a millionaire and told him not to travel with the substitute driver to see his wife. The next morning, there was a luxury car near her humble home. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Grace Donovan pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Caldwell Enterprises, 3:15 in the morning, the witching hour when New York's financial giants slept while she worked in their shadows. Her rubber-soled shoes squeaked softly against the polished floor, the only sound breaking the cathedral silence of the 52nd floor. Grace had walked these halls for 5 years now, every weeknight from midnight to 8 a.m. She knew every corner, every executive office, every hiding spot where important documents got forgotten behind potted plants. But more than that, she knew the weight of invisible labor, the kind that kept the world spinning while everyone else dreamed. At 30, Grace carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned life's hardest lessons early. Her dark hair was always pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform, navy blue with Donovan stitched in white cursive, was immaculately clean despite the nature of her work. She took pride in that, pride in showing up, pride in doing the job right, pride in being someone her 3 kids could look up to. The Bronx felt like another planet from up here, 47 floors below. The city sparkled like scattered diamonds, but Grace knew the real story behind those lights. Every glowing window represented someone working late, someone struggling, someone trying to make it through another day. Just like her, she paused at the floor-to-ceiling windows, cart handle still in her grip. Somewhere out there, past the Hudson River, her kids were sleeping in their shared bedroom. Miguel, 13, probably had his math homework spread across the kitchen table. He always saved it for last because numbers didn't come easy to him, just like they hadn't for his father. Sophia, 10, would be curled up with her worn copy of Charlotte's Web, using the streetlight to read past bedtime. And little Carlos, 7, slept like his dad used to, on his stomach with one arm hanging off the bed, completely at peace with the world. David had been gone 3 years now, construction accident on a high-rise project in Queens. One moment he was texting her about picking up milk on the way home. The next moment, Grace was sitting in a hospital waiting room that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. The settlement barely covered the funeral costs, and life insurance was a luxury they'd never been able to afford. "Mrs. Donovan?" Grace startled, turning to find Mr. Richard Caldwell himself, standing in the doorway of his corner office. Even at 3 in the morning, he was impeccably dressed. Crisp white shirt, tie loosened just enough to suggest humanity beneath the executive armor. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly styled, and his blue eyes held a kindness that seemed almost out of place in a building dedicated to profit margins. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were still here. I can come back later." No, please." He gestured toward his office, where warm light spilled from a desk lamp. "I was just finishing up some contracts. Don't let me interrupt your work." This was their routine. 3, maybe 4 times a month. She'd find him burning the midnight oil. He always acknowledged her presence, always treated her with the same courtesy he'd show a board member. In 5 years, he'd never once made her feel invisible the way some of the younger executives did. "Working late again?" Grace asked, resuming her cleaning while trying not to look at the family photo on his desk. Richard and his stunning wife Isabella at some charity gala, both smiling perfect smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Unfortunately, yes, the Miami development project is more complicated than we anticipated." He rubbed his temples. "Lots of moving pieces, lots of people counting on everything going smoothly." Grace nodded, spraying glass cleaner on the conference table. She'd overheard enough conversations while emptying wastebaskets to know that Caldwell Enterprises was expanding into luxury resorts down in Florida. Big money, high stakes, the kind of deals that made or broke careers. "Your family must miss you during these late nights," she said, then immediately regretted the personal comment. But Mr. Caldwell didn't seem to mind. They're used to it by now, I suppose. Something flickered across his face. Loneliness, maybe, or resignation. "What about you, Mrs. Donovan? How are your children doing?" The fact that he remembered she had kids, that he'd bothered to learn her name beyond what was stitched on her uniform, meant more to Grace than he could possibly know, in a building full of people who looked through her like she was furniture. His simple human decency stood out like a lighthouse. "They're doing well. Thank you for asking." Miguel just made honor roll, and Sophia's in the school play next month. Carlos is, well, he's 7. Everything's an adventure when you're 7. Richard smiled. A real smile this time. Not the polished corporate version. That's wonderful. You should be proud. I am. Grace moved to the windows, wiping away fingerprints that would be invisible by morning light. They're good kids. They understand that Mama has to work nights so we can have a better life. They're lucky to have you. The simple statement hung in the air between them. Grace felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. When was the last time someone had said she was doing a good job? When had anyone acknowledged that raising 3 kids alone while working full-time wasn't just survival? It was heroic. Thank you. Mr. Caldwell, that means a lot. He was already turning back to his computer, but she caught his nod of acknowledgement. Grace finished cleaning his office in comfortable silence, the clicking of his keyboard providing a gentle rhythm to her work. When she was done, she gave a small wave goodbye and pushed her cart toward the next office. The elevator bank was quiet as she made her way to the executive washrooms. This was always the strangest part of her night. Cleaning spaces so luxurious they put most people's homes to shame. Marble countertops, gold fixtures, towels that cost more than her grocery budget. Sometimes she wondered what it would be like to live in a world where such excess was normal, where you never had to choose between buying your kid new shoes or paying the electric bill. But as she caught her reflection in the ornate mirror, Grace straightened her shoulders. She had something these wealthy executives couldn't buy, the bone-deep satisfaction of honest work, of knowing that every dollar she earned came from her own sweat and determination. Her kids would grow up understanding the value of hard work, of treating everyone with dignity regardless of their bank account balance. The night stretched ahead of her, hours of quiet labor in the shadows of American capitalism. But Grace didn't mind the solitude. These silent midnights were hers. Time to think, to plan, to dream of better days ahead. Tomorrow, her kids would wake up fed and clothed and loved, and that was worth every squeaky step down these marble hallways. She had no way of knowing that in just a few days, these familiar corridors would become the stage for a drama that would change all their lives forever. The penthouse overlooking Central Park was a monument to wealth and emptiness. Richard Caldwell sat at one end of the 12-foot dining table, methodically cutting his salmon, while Isabella picked at her salad at the opposite end. The distance between them might as well have been an ocean. The Hartmans are hosting their annual charity gala next month, Isabella said, her voice carrying the practiced disinterest of someone making small talk with a stranger. I suppose we should make an appearance. Of course. Richard didn't look up from his plate. Which charity is it this time? Something about literacy. Does it matter? Isabella's fork clinked against the fine china as she set it down. Even her frustration was elegant. A perfectly manicured hand running through honey blonde hair that cost more to maintain than most people's monthly rent. At 38, Isabella Monroe Caldwell was still stunning in the way that graced magazine covers and stopped traffic. Her personal trainer kept her body runway ready. Her stylist ensured she never appeared less than perfect. And her social calendar was managed with military precision. She was everything a successful man's wife should be: beautiful, accomplished, socially connected, and utterly miserable. Richard continued eating in silence, scrolling through emails on his phone. Even at dinner, business called. Isabella watched him with growing irritation. Remembering when his focused intensity had seemed attractive rather than suffocating, they'd met 6 years ago at a gallery opening in Soho. She was at the height of her modeling career. He was the rising star of Manhattan real estate. Their courtship had been swift and public. Romantic dinners photographed by society pages, weekend getaways to the Hamptons, an engagement announcement that made the style section of the Times. The wedding had been perfect. 300 guests, St. Patrick's Cathedral, a reception at the plaza that cost more than most people's houses. Isabella had looked radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown, and Richard had been the picture of the successful groom. The photographers captured every moment of their fairy tale beginning. What they hadn't captured was the slow death of everything real between them. I hired a new driver today, Richard said suddenly, breaking her reverie. Williams gave his notice yesterday. Family emergency in Seattle. Isabella's attention sharpened slightly. Williams had been with them for 3 years. Professional, discreet, utterly forgettable. The kind of employee who blended into the background of their carefully orchestrated lives. Did you go through the agency? Yes, they sent over someone with excellent references, former military, very experienced with executive protection and transportation. Richard finally looked up from his phone. He starts tomorrow. I have that early meeting with the Miami investors, so he'll be picking me up at 7. The Miami project. Isabella had heard enough fragments of Richard's phone conversations to know it was his biggest deal yet. A luxury resort development in the Florida Keys that could double their already substantial wealth. Not that more money would change anything between them. She nodded absently, her mind already drifting to tomorrow's schedule. Pilates at 10, lunch with the museum board at noon, spa appointment at 3, the comfortable routine of a life without purpose. After dinner, they retreated to their separate spaces like actors leaving a stage. Richard disappeared into his home office, door closing with a soft click that felt like a prison cell locking. Isabella wandered to her sitting room, pouring herself a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than many people's weekly salary. The room was her sanctuary, decorated in soft creams and golds that complemented her coloring. Fashion magazines lay scattered across the coffee table next to charity event invitations and spa appointment cards through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Central Park stretched out like a private garden, but even the view felt hollow tonight. Isabella curled up in her favorite chair, wine glass in hand, and let her mind drift back to Milan. She'd been 24, walking for Versace and Armani, living in a tiny apartment that she'd shared with 2 other models. Life had been chaotic, uncertain, financially precarious, and she'd never been happier. The modeling world was brutal. No question. Constant rejection, impossible beauty standards, an expiration date that started ticking the moment you turned 25, but there had been something intoxicating about the unpredictability, the creative energy, the feeling that anything could happen. Then her mother had gotten sick, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover, treatments that required someone to care for her full time. Isabella had flown home to Ohio, watching her vibrant, independent mother waste away in a hospital bed that smelled like antiseptic and broken dreams. The modeling offers had dried up during those 6 months. In fashion, absence wasn't just career suicide, it was complete erasure. By the time her mother passed, Isabella's savings were gone. Her contacts had moved on, and younger faces had taken her place on agency walls. That's when she'd met Richard. He'd been kind during her grief, patient with her uncertainty about the future. When he proposed after 8 months of dating, it had felt like salvation rather than love, security instead of passion. Until death do us part, she'd promised at the altar. But she hadn't realized she'd be the one dying, slowly, quietly, suffocated by silk and diamonds. The sound of Richard's office door opening interrupted her brooding. He appeared in the doorway, loosening his tie with the weary gesture of someone who carried the weight of too many responsibilities. "I'm heading to bed," he said. "Early morning tomorrow." The new driver, Isabella remembered. "What's his name?" "Brooks, Ethan Brooks." Richard paused, studying her face with the attention he usually reserved for contracts. "Are you all right? You seem distant tonight." The irony wasn't lost on her. They'd been distant for years, ships passing in the gilded hallways of their loveless marriage. But she managed a smile, the same practiced expression she'd worn for countless photographers. "Just tired. You know how these charity things drain me." He nodded, accepting the lie because truth would require emotional energy. Neither of them was willing to invest. "Sleep well, Isabella." After he left, the silence settled around her like fog. Isabella finished her wine and tried to imagine tomorrow. Another day in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt like a beautiful prison. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring Ethan Brooks into their lives, setting in motion events that would either destroy everything they'd built or finally set her free from the gilded cage she'd chosen. In the distance, a siren wailed through the New York night. Someone else's emergency, someone else's crisis. Isabella pulled her cashmere throw tighter around her shoulders and wondered what it would feel like to have something, anything, matter enough to make her heart race again. The penthouse walls held their secrets well, but even the most expensive silence couldn't muffle the sound of a marriage dying one perfect dinner at a time. 2 weeks had passed since Ethan Brooks joined the Caldwell household, and Grace noticed the change immediately. It wasn't just that Mrs. Caldwell looked different. though she did, with a new glow in her cheeks, and a spring in her step that hadn't been there before. It was something in the air itself, an electric tension that made Grace's skin prickle as she cleaned the executive floors. Thursday night, December 15th, Grace pushed her cart past the conference rooms, humming softly to keep herself company. The building was particularly quiet tonight. Even Mr. Caldwell had left early for some business dinner downtown. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing down on her shoulders like a weighted blanket. She was heading toward the executive washrooms when she heard voices drifting from the small meeting room near the elevator bank. Grace paused, instinctively checking her watch. 3:20 a.m. Who could possibly be up here at this hour? Can't keep meeting like this, a woman's voice whispered urgently. Grace recognized it immediately. Mrs. Caldwell's cultured tones, but strained with an emotion she'd never heard before. Then let's stop meeting and start living, came the reply in a deep, masculine voice that definitely wasn't Mr. Caldwell's. Isabella, we've talked about this 100 times. You're miserable with him. Grace froze, her hand gripping the cart handle. She should leave, walk away, pretend she'd heard nothing, maintain the careful blindness that kept service workers employed. But something in Mrs. Caldwell's voice, desperation mixed with fear, rooted her to the spot. You don't understand, Ethan. It's not that simple. The prenup, the social circles, the business connections. Screw the prenup. The man's voice rose slightly, then dropped back to a harsh whisper. We could disappear tomorrow, start over somewhere warm, somewhere nobody knows us. I've got money saved, and you're smart, beautiful, capable of anything. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. This was Mrs. Caldwell having an affair with the new driver. She should definitely leave now, report some bathroom emergency and come back in an hour. But her feet seemed glued to the marble floor. And give up everything, the apartment, the lifestyle, the security. Isabella's laugh was bitter. You're asking me to trade a cage made of gold for... what exactly? For love? For freedom? For a life where you don't have to pretend every single day? A long silence stretched between them. Grace could hear her own breathing, loud as thunder in her ears. Then came a sound that made her stomach drop. The unmistakable sound of kissing, desperate and hungry. God, Isabella. Ethan's voice was rough with desire. I can't stand watching you with him, pretending to be the perfect wife. You're dying in that marriage, piece by piece. I know. Isabella's voice broke on the words. But Ethan, even if I wanted to leave, Richard would never just let me walk away. He's too proud, too controlling. The divorce would be vicious, public, and I'd end up with nothing. Another pause. Grace pressed herself against the wall, knowing she should run but unable to move. What if... Ethan's voice dropped so low Grace had to strain to hear. What if there was another way? What if you didn't have to worry about divorce proceedings or prenups or any of it? What do you mean? Grace's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Something in the man's tone sent every maternal instinct she possessed into high alert. This was the voice of danger, of someone crossing lines that should never be crossed. The Miami trip next week. Richard mentioned it yesterday, driving down to the Keys to check on the resort site. Long trip, dangerous roads. Ethan, what are you saying? I'm saying accidents happen, Isabella, especially on those winding coastal highways, especially when a man is driving alone with his thoughts. Maybe had a few drinks at dinner, hit a patch of rain. Grace's knees nearly buckled. They weren't just talking about an affair. They were planning murder. You can't be serious. But Isabella's voice held no shock, only a terrible kind of hope that made Grace's soul sick. Dead serious. Look, I know these roads like the back of my hand. Drove them plenty when I was stationed in Miami. There's this one stretch on the overseas highway, about 30 miles from Key West. Narrow, winding, drops off into the ocean on one side. Cars go off there all the time. Coast Guard's always fishing somebody out of the water. Grace pressed her fist to her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not in the clean, orderly world of Caldwell Enterprises, where her biggest worry was usually whether she'd remembered to restock the executive bathroom towels. How would you? Isabella's voice trailed off. The brakes, easy to sabotage if you know what you're doing, and I sure as hell do. A little hydraulic fluid leak, maybe some worn brake pads that finally give out at exactly the wrong moment, Happens to older cars all the time. But Richard's car is brand new. Ethan chuckled, and the sound made Grace's skin crawl. Funny thing about brake systems, they can fail on any car if they're not properly maintained. And who's going to question the grieving widow about mechanical details? Especially when the car ends up at the bottom of the ocean. Silence stretched between them like a poisonous thread. Grace could hear her own pulse pounding in her ears, could taste copper fear in the back of her throat. "How long?" Isabella finally whispered. "How long? What? How long have you been planning this?" Another chuckle. "Since about 5 minutes after I met you." "Beautiful. You think I took this job for the health insurance? I did my research on Richard Caldwell, on his habits, his roots, his vulnerabilities. Rich bastard like him was bound to have enemies. And if something goes wrong, if we get caught, we won't. Clean, simple, untraceable, tragic accident. Loving wife inherits everything. And after a respectful mourning period, you find comfort with someone new, someone who helped you through your grief." Grace realized she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face as the full horror of what she was hearing sank in. Mr. Caldwell, who always said please and thank you, who remembered her children's names, who treated her with basic human dignity in a world that usually made her invisible. They were planning to murder him for his money. When? Isabella's voice was barely audible now. Next Friday, he leaves for Miami Thursday evening, drives down to the Keys Friday morning to check the resort site. Perfect isolated stretch of road, perfect weather forecast. By Friday afternoon, you'll be a very wealthy widow. And us, we wait. 6 months, maybe a year. Let the dust settle. Let people forget. Then we take our fortune and disappear into paradise. The sound of movement made Grace panic. They were done talking, which meant they'd be leaving soon. She grabbed her cart and fled toward the stairwell, her rubber shoes silent on the marble as she raced down 2 flights before daring to breathe. In the fluorescent-lit safety of the supply closet, Grace finally let herself fall apart. She sobbed into her hands, her whole body shaking with the magnitude of what she'd overheard. Murder. Cold-blooded, premeditated murder of a good man by his own wife and trusted employee. What was she supposed to do with this terrible knowledge? Who would believe a night janitor over a socialite and her lover? How could she possibly stop what was already in motion? But as Grace thought of her own children sleeping safely in the Bronx, she knew she had no choice. Whatever the cost, she couldn't let this happen. Grace didn't sleep that morning. She sat at her kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, still in her work uniform, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The overheard conversation played on repeat in her mind like a broken record, each word cutting deeper than the last. Accidents happen, Isabella, especially on those winding coastal highways. Her hands shook as she lifted the mug to her lips. The coffee tasted like ash, but she needed something to do with her trembling fingers. Outside her window, the Bronx was waking up. Garbage trucks rumbling down the street, early commuters heading to subway stations, the familiar symphony of a working-class neighborhood starting another day. Miguel shuffled into the kitchen at 6:30, his teenage hair sticking up at impossible angles. At 13, he was already showing signs of the man he'd become. David's strong jaw, his gentle eyes, his way of noticing when something was wrong. "Mama, you okay?" He paused in his hunt through the refrigerator, studying her with concern that seemed too old for his years. "Just tired, mijo. Long night at work." Grace forced a smile, the lie burning her throat. She'd never lied to her children before, but how could she explain that she'd stumbled into a nightmare that threatened to consume them all? "You sure? You look like you saw a ghost or something." Sophia bounced in next, 10 years old and pure morning energy despite the early hour. "Mama's always tired after work. That's why rich people sleep at night and poor people work." She said it matter-of-factly, without bitterness. A child's simple observation about the way the world worked, Grace's heart clenched, was that the lesson she was teaching them, that their place in life was to labor in the shadows while others slept peacefully in their mansions. "That's not exactly how it works, baby," she said softly, helping Sophia pour cereal into a bowl. "Different people work different hours. Some people work days, some work nights. It doesn't make anyone better or worse." But even as she said the words, she thought about Isabella Caldwell, who'd never worked a day in her life, planning to murder her husband for money while Grace scrubbed floors to keep her children fed. Maybe the world wasn't as fair as she wanted Sophia to believe. Carlos wandered in last. 7 years old and still in dinosaur pajamas, dragging his stuffed elephant behind him. He climbed into Grace's lap without invitation, snuggling against her chest the way he'd done since he was tiny. "You smell like that building soap," he mumbled into her shoulder. "Sorry, baby. Mama needs to shower." But she didn't move. Couldn't bear to disturb the warm weight of her youngest child. Carlos still believed the world was safe, that monsters only existed in fairy tales, that Mama could fix anything with a kiss and a band-aid. How long before life taught him otherwise? After the kids left for school, Miguel walking Sophia and Carlos to the corner where the crossing guard waited, Grace finally allowed herself to fall apart completely. She cried until her throat was raw, until her eyes felt like sandpaper, until there were no tears left. Then she prayed. Grace had been raised Catholic, though she attended Mass sporadically now due to her work schedule. But in moments like this, the faith her mother had instilled in her rose to the surface like oil on water. She knelt beside her bed, hands clasped, and poured her heart out to a God who sometimes felt very far away. "Mary, Mother of God, what am I supposed to do? I'm just a cleaning lady who's going to believe me, but I can't let them kill that man. He's got a family, people who depend on him, and those children. They don't deserve to lose their father the way mine did." She stayed on her knees for 20 minutes, waiting for some divine inspiration that didn't come. But slowly, gradually, a different kind of strength began to build in her chest. Not the lightning bolt of religious revelation, but the quiet steadiness of moral certainty. David used to say that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing the right thing despite being terrified. He'd lived that philosophy every day, working dangerous construction jobs to provide for his family, always choosing responsibility over safety. Grace rose from her knees with shaking legs but steady resolve. She would tell Mr. Caldwell what she'd heard. It might cost her job, might get her laughed out of the building, might even put her family in danger. But she couldn't live with herself if she stayed silent and let a murder happen. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of nervous energy. Grace cleaned her already spotless apartment, did laundry that didn't need washing, helped Carlos with homework that he'd already finished. Her mind kept cycling through possible scenarios, each one worse than the last. What if Mr. Caldwell thought she was lying to get attention? What if he confronted his wife, who then realized Grace had overheard their conversation? What if they decided to eliminate the witness before carrying out their original plan? But every time her courage wavered, she thought about her own children. If someone was planning to kill her, wouldn't she want to know? Wouldn't she pray that some guardian angel would find the strength to warn her? Evening came too quickly and too slowly. Grace kissed her children goodbye with extra fervor, holding Carlos a beat too long, memorizing the feel of his small arms around her neck. "You're being weird today, Mama," Sophia observed with the brutal honesty of a 10-year-old. "Just love you guys so much," Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. Miguel gave her a sharp look, but didn't comment. He was too much like his father, protective, observant, worried when the adults in his life seemed troubled. The subway ride to Manhattan felt endless. Grace sat pressed between tired commuters, rehearsing what she would say to Mr. Caldwell. The words felt clumsy in her mouth, inadequate for the magnitude of what she'd discovered. "Mr. Caldwell, I overheard your wife planning to murder you. Too blunt, sir. I think you might be in danger. Too vague. I need to tell you something about Mrs. Caldwell and the new driver. Too gossipy." By the time she reached the Caldwell building, Grace had worked herself into a state of near panic. Her uniform felt too tight, her hands were slick with sweat, and her heart was beating so fast she wondered if she might faint in the marble lobby. The security guard nodded familiarly as she signed in. Same routine, same building, but everything felt different now. The elevator ride to the 52nd floor seemed to take forever, each floor marker lighting up like a countdown to disaster. Grace found Mr. Caldwell in his office, bent over architectural plans spread across his desk. He looked up as she knocked hesitantly on the doorframe. "Mrs. Donovan, you're early tonight. Everything all right?" This was it, the moment that would change everything. Grace stepped into the office, closed the door behind her, and took a deep breath that felt like diving off a cliff. "Mr. Caldwell, I need to tell you something." Something terrible. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. About your wife and the driver. Richard's expression shifted from mild curiosity to sharp attention. What about them? Grace's hands were shaking so violently she had to clasp them together. I overheard them talking last night. They're planning to hurt you during your trip to Miami. The words hung in the air between them like a loaded weapon. Mr. Caldwell's face went very still, very pale. Outside his office windows, the city sparkled with a million lights. But inside this room, the world had just tilted on its axis. The silence that followed Grace's words seemed to stretch for eternity. Richard Caldwell sat frozen behind his mahogany desk, the architectural plans forgotten beneath his white-knuckled hands. His blue eyes searched Grace's face with the intensity of a man trying to determine if he was looking at salvation or madness. Mrs. Donovan, he said carefully, his voice controlled but strained. That's an extremely serious accusation. Are you absolutely certain about what you heard? Grace's throat felt like sandpaper, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. Yes, sir. They were in the small conference room near the elevators, around 3:20 in the morning. I heard them talking about making it look like an accident on the highway to the Keys. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. For the first time since Grace had known him, he looked genuinely rattled, like a man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. And you're certain it was Isabella and Ethan? Yes, sir. I recognized Mrs. Caldwell's voice immediately, and the man called her Isabella, talked about being stationed in Miami before. It had to be Mr. Brooks. The name seemed to hit Richard like a physical blow. He closed his eyes briefly, and Grace caught a glimpse of the pain beneath his corporate composure. Not just the shock of betrayal, but the deeper wound of a marriage that had died so completely that murder seemed preferable to divorce. Why are you telling me this? He asked suddenly. You could lose your job, maybe worse, if what you're saying is true. Grace thought of Carlos's sleepy face that morning, of Sophia's homework spread across their kitchen table, of Miguel's protective instincts that reminded her so much of David. Because it's the right thing to do, and because... She hesitated, then forged ahead. Because you've always treated me like a human being. Mr. Caldwell, in 5 years, you've never once looked through me like I was invisible. That means something. Richard's expression softened slightly, but the tension remained in his shoulders. The careful alertness of a man who just learned he was walking through a minefield. What exactly did they say? Every detail you can remember. Grace recounted the conversation as precisely as she could, watching Richard's face grow paler with each revelation. When she described Ethan's casual discussion of brake failure and highway accidents, Richard actually flinched. The overseas highway, he murmured. I've driven it dozens of times. Those curves over the water. He trailed off, lost in contemplation of his own mortality. Mr. Caldwell, they said Friday, tomorrow is Thursday, and you're supposed to leave for Miami tomorrow night. Aren't you? Richard nodded slowly. The resort inspection is scheduled for Friday morning. I was planning to drive down Thursday evening, stay overnight in Key Largo, then continue to the site in the morning. He paused. Exactly like Ethan suggested would be perfect timing. The weight of that realization settled over both of them like a shroud. Grace could see Richard processing not just the immediate danger, but the elaborate planning that had gone into it. How long his wife and driver had been plotting his death while he'd unknowingly provided them with the perfect opportunity. What are you going to do? Grace asked quietly. Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the glittering cityscape. When he spoke, his voice held a new hardness that Grace had never heard before. First, I'm going to cancel the Miami trip. Some kind of emergency. Maybe a migraine. Something that would come on suddenly. He reached for his phone, then stopped. But I can't just accuse them without proof. If I'm wrong, you don't believe me. The words came out flatter than Grace intended. It's not that I don't believe you, Mrs. Donovan. It's that I can't afford to be wrong. If Isabella is innocent, and I destroy our marriage over a misunderstanding, I'd never forgive myself. And if she's guilty, he let the sentence hang unfinished. Grace understood. Richard Caldwell hadn't built an empire by making rash decisions based on incomplete information. Even faced with potential murder, he was thinking like a businessman. Careful, methodical, evidence-based. What if you're right, though? Grace pressed. What if they're really planning to kill you, and you give them time to come up with a different plan? Then I'll be ready for them. Richard's jaw tightened with determination. But first, I need to know for certain. I need proof that would hold up in court, not just overheard conversations. He picked up his phone and dialed a number from memory. Marcus, it's Richard Caldwell. I need your team for an urgent matter. Discreet surveillance, possible infidelity investigation. Can you have someone here within the hour? Grace listened, as Richard arranged for private investigators with the same calm efficiency he probably used to negotiate million-dollar deals. But beneath his composed exterior, she could see the cracks, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes kept darting to the family photo on his desk. After he hung up, they sat in uncomfortable silence. The mundane sounds of the office, the hum of computers, the distant ding of elevator bells, seemed surreal against the backdrop of murder and betrayal they were discussing. Mrs. Donovan, I want you to know that regardless of how this turns out, you did the right thing coming to me. That took tremendous courage. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. I kept thinking about my own children, what I'd want someone to do if they knew I was in danger. Your children are lucky to have you as their mother. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning. Here was a man whose wife was planning his murder, praising a woman whose only crime was caring enough to speak up. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. I should get back to work, Grace said finally. Try to act normal in case they're watching. Richard nodded. Be careful, Mrs. Donovan. If what you've told me is true, these people have already crossed lines that can't be uncrossed. They won't hesitate to silence a witness. The warning sent ice through Grace's veins, but she forced herself to nod calmly. She'd already committed to this path. There was no turning back now. As she left Richard's office, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just lit a fuse on a bomb whose explosion would devastate more lives than just Richard's. But she also knew, with the bone-deep certainty her mother had instilled in her, that silence in the face of evil was its own kind of sin. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of nervous energy. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every unexpected sound made her jump. When she finally made it home as the sun was rising over the Bronx, Grace collapsed into bed fully clothed, too exhausted to even change out of her uniform. She dreamed of highways stretching endlessly over dark water, of brake lights failing in the night, of children waking up to find their mother had vanished without a trace. But underneath the nightmares ran a deeper current of hope, the possibility that sometimes courage was enough to change the ending of a story that seemed already written. Tomorrow would bring answers, one way or another. Grace only prayed they'd all survive long enough to hear them. 72 hours. That's all it took for Richard Caldwell's world to implode completely. The private investigators Marcus had recommended were thorough, discreet, and ruthlessly efficient. Within 6 hours of Grace's revelation, they had installed micro-surveillance equipment in the small conference room where she'd overheard the conspiracy. By Thursday morning, they had Isabella and Ethan under constant watch. Cameras, audio recording, even GPS tracking on both their phones. Richard sat in Marcus Webb's downtown office, staring at a manila folder that contained the wreckage of his marriage and the blueprint for his murder. The private investigator, a former FBI agent with silver hair and tired eyes, had seen everything during his 30-year career, but even he seemed subdued by the evidence they'd compiled. I'm sorry, Richard. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he opened the folder. The first photograph hit him like a physical blow. Isabella and Ethan in a passionate embrace outside a hotel in Queens. Taken through a telephoto lens with timestamp precision, Wednesday afternoon, while Richard had been in meetings about quarterly projections. How long? His voice came out as barely a whisper. Based on the phone records, at least 6 weeks, but probably longer. They were just more careful before. Marcus leaned forward in his chair. Richard, this goes way beyond infidelity. Keep reading. The next pages contained transcripts from the surveillance equipment. Seeing the words in black and white somehow made them more real, more terrifying than Grace's whispered account had been. Ethan Brooks. The brake lines are easy to access on his car. I've already checked. 2 small cuts in exactly the right places, and the fluid will leak out gradually during the drive. By the time he hits those curves near Key West, he'll have no stopping power at all. Isabella Caldwell. And you're certain it will look like an accident? Ethan Brooks. Absolutely. Cars go off that stretch of highway all the time. Current's strong there. By the time they find the wreckage, if they ever do, there won't be enough left to determine what caused the crash. Richard's vision blurred as he read his own death sentence. Planned with the casual efficiency of a business meeting. These weren't crimes of passion or desperate acts of self-defense. This was cold, calculated murder for financial gain. There's more, Marcus said gently. The financial records were equally damning. Ethan Brooks had opened 3 separate bank accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 2 months. Isabella had been quietly liquidating jewelry and transferring funds to an account in Switzerland. They'd even researched property in countries with no extradition treaties to the United States. They were planning to disappear, Richard said, the pieces falling into place. After a reasonable mourning period. 6 months according to their text messages. Long enough to avoid suspicion. Short enough that Isabella wouldn't have to maintain the Grieving Widow Act indefinitely. Richard flipped through more photographs. Isabella meeting with a divorce attorney 3 months ago, then abruptly canceling all future appointments. Ethan purchasing tools from a hardware store, paying cash, security footage of them together in restaurants, hotels, even in Richard's own garage where Ethan had been studying the car he intended to sabotage. The vehicle inspection reports are particularly interesting, Marcus continued. Your Mercedes was in perfect condition 2 weeks ago, but yesterday, Ethan spent 47 minutes alone in your garage. We have him on security camera, working underneath the car. So it's already done. Richard's voice was flat, emotionless. If I'd driven to Miami as planned, you'd be dead by now, yes. The reality of it settled over Richard like a funeral shroud. His wife, the woman who'd promised to love and honor him, who shared his bed and his name and his public life, had been actively planning his murder. Not in a moment of rage or desperation, but as a methodical solution to an inconvenient marriage. Have you heard enough, or do you want the rest? Marcus asked. There's more. The recordings from last night after you canceled the Miami trip. Richard nodded grimly. He needed to know everything, no matter how much it hurt. Marcus pressed play on a digital recorder. Isabella's voice filled the office, clear and unmistakably venomous. Isabella Caldwell. He never gets sick. Never. Suddenly he has a migraine on the exact day we planned. Something's wrong, Ethan Brooks. You're being paranoid. Rich guys get stress headaches all the time. Isabella Caldwell. Not Richard. He once gave a presentation with a kidney stone. He doesn't cancel business trips for headaches. Ethan Brooks. So what are you saying? Isabella Caldwell. I'm saying maybe someone tipped him off. Maybe someone knows more than they should. Ethan Brooks. Like who? Isabella Caldwell. I don't know, but we need to be careful, and we need another plan. Richard stopped the recording. They suspect something. Gets worse. Keep listening. Ethan Brooks. What about the cleaning lady? She's always around at weird hours. Maybe she saw something. Isabella Caldwell? Grace. She's nobody. A single mother from the Bronx who barely speaks above a whisper. Richard probably doesn't even know her name. Ethan Brooks, maybe. But if she did hear something, we'd need to deal with that problem before we deal with Richard. Isabella Caldwell. Meaning what? Ethan Brooks, meaning accidents can happen to more than just rich husbands. Isabella. Cleaning ladies work dangerous jobs. Industrial accidents, falls down elevator shafts, muggings gone wrong in bad neighborhoods. The recording ended, leaving only the hum of Marcus's office air conditioning. Richard sat in stunned silence, processing the casual way they'd discussed murdering Grace, a woman whose only crime was working hard to support her children. They're planning to kill her too, he said finally. That's certainly how it sounds. We've got units watching Mrs. Donovan's building now, and I've briefed the NYPD. But Richard, we need to move fast. These people have already proven they're willing to commit murder. Every hour we delay increases the risk to both you and Mrs. Donovan. Richard closed the folder with steady hands, his shock crystallizing into cold fury. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted with his life and his fortune, had betrayed him in the most fundamental way possible. But more than that, she'd threatened an innocent woman whose only fault was having a conscience. What do you recommend? Full confrontation with law enforcement present. We've got more than enough evidence for conspiracy to commit murder charges. The day will want to move quickly. Attempted murder of a wealthy businessman gets headlines, and headlines get convictions. Richard thought of Grace Donovan, probably getting her children ready for school right now, unaware that cold-blooded killers were discussing her death. Thought of her courage in coming forward, despite having everything to lose and nothing to gain. How soon can we move? Tonight. We'll need you to act normal until then. Go home. Have dinner with Isabella. Don't let on that anything has changed. Can you do that? Richard nodded, though the thought of sitting across from his would-be murderer at the dinner table made his stomach turn. What about Mrs. Donovan? We'll have protection on her round the clock, and after tonight she'll be safe. They both will be. As Richard left Marcus's office, carrying the evidence of his wife's betrayal in a briefcase that felt heavier than concrete, he realized that Grace Donovan had saved 2 lives with her courage, his and her own. Tonight, justice would finally have its day. The penthouse felt like a stage set for a tragedy as Richard walked through the front door at exactly 6:30 p.m. Isabella was in the living room, arranging white orchids in a crystal vase, the picture of domestic elegance. She looked up with that practiced smile he'd once found charming, now knowing it masked the heart of a killer. "How was your day, darling? Are you feeling better?" Her voice carried just the right note of wifely concern. "Much better. Thank you." Richard marveled at how easily the lie slipped out. He'd spent the day learning to act, to pretend normalcy while federal agents positioned themselves throughout their building. The migraine finally broke around noon. Isabella's eyes flickered with something, relief, suspicion, but her smile never wavered. "I'm so glad. I was worried about you canceling the Miami trip so suddenly. You were worried about your murder plan falling apart," Richard thought, but kept his expression neutral. "Just one of those things. We can reschedule for next week." "Of course." Isabella turned back to her flowers, but Richard caught the slight tremor in her hands. She was nervous, on edge. Good. Dinner was an exercise in surreal normalcy. They sat at opposite ends of their mahogany table, discussing charity events and social obligations, while federal agents listened from the apartment next door. Isabella had prepared sea bass with lemon butter, his favorite, which might have been touching if he didn't know she was planning his funeral. "Ethan seems to be working out well," Isabella said casually, cutting her fish with surgical precision. "Very professional, very reliable." Richard nearly choked on his wine. Yes, he certainly made an impression. They were interrupted by the doorbell. 3 sharp chimes that made Isabella's fork clatter against her plate. Richard glanced at his watch. 8 p.m. exactly. Right on schedule. "Were you expecting someone?" Isabella's voice carried a note of panic she couldn't quite suppress. "Actually, yes." Richard stood slowly, his heart hammering despite his outward calm. "Some business associates wanted to discuss the Miami project. I hope you don't mind." Before Isabella could respond, Richard opened the door to reveal Marcus Webb, Detective Sarah Chen from the NYPD, and FBI agent Michael Torres. Behind them stood 2 uniformed officers and, to Richard's surprise, Grace Donovan. Isabella rose from her chair like a sleepwalker, her face draining of color as she took in the group at their door. "Richard, what's going on?" "That's what I'd like to know," Richard said quietly. He walked to the living room bar and poured himself 3 fingers of scotch with remarkably steady hands. "You see, Isabella, someone came to me with a very disturbing story about conversations overheard in conference rooms, about brake lines and highway accidents, about insurance payouts and new lives in paradise." Isabella's knees gave out, and she sank back into her chair. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Caldwell." Detective Chen stepped forward, her voice professionally courteous but implacable. "We have recordings of conversations between you and Ethan Brooks discussing plans to murder your husband. We have financial records showing your preparation for his death. We have security footage of Mr. Brooks tampering with your husband's vehicle. That's impossible." Isabella's voice was barely a whisper, but her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. Agent Torres produced a digital tablet. "Would you like to hear the recordings, Mrs. Caldwell? We have several hours of very detailed planning sessions." The sound of Isabella's own voice filled the penthouse. "By Friday afternoon, you'll be a very wealthy widow." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Isabella's composure finally cracked completely. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob. deep, wrenching sounds that might have been genuine remorse or simply the grief of getting caught. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She gasped between tears. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I was just so unhappy, so trapped. The marriage was already dead, Richard. We've been strangers for years. So you decided to make me literally dead. Richard's voice was quieter than a whisper, but it cut through Isabella's sobs like a blade. Instead of divorce, instead of conversation, instead of any civilized solution, you chose murder. You don't understand. Isabella looked up with mascara streaming down her cheeks. The prenup, the social humiliation, starting over with nothing at my age. I'd have been destroyed, so you destroyed us instead. Richard set down his scotch glass with deliberate care. Tell me about Ethan, Isabella. When did seducing the help become part of your survival strategy? Isabella flinched as if he'd struck her. It wasn't like that. He understood me, made me feel alive again. For the first time in years, someone actually wanted me, not just my connections or my appearance at charity events. He wanted your money, Isabella, just like you wanted mine. Richard's voice held no anger now, only profound sadness. The difference is, I never planned to kill you for it. Where is Mr. Brooks? Detective Chen interjected. Isabella's head snapped up, a new fear blooming in her eyes. He should be here by now. We were supposed to meet tonight to discuss new plans since Richard canceled the trip, as if summoned by her words. The sound of footsteps echoed from the private elevator. Ethan Brooks stepped into the penthouse, his confident stride faltering as he took in the scene. Federal agents, police officers, and his lover sobbing in a designer chair. What the hell is going on here? Ethan's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. But Agent Torres was faster. FBI, hands where we can see them, Mr. Brooks. Ethan's eyes found Isabella's across the room, and something passed between them. A moment of mutual understanding that their carefully planned future had just evaporated. You told them, Ethan said to Isabella, his voice flat with betrayal. I didn't have to tell them anything, Isabella sobbed. They have recordings, Ethan. Hours of recordings. For a moment, Ethan looked like he might run or fight. His muscles tensed, his eyes calculating distances to exits. But then his gaze landed on Richard, standing calmly by the bar with federal agents flanking him, and the reality of the situation sank in. How did you know? Ethan asked Richard directly. Richard looked past Ethan to where Grace stood quietly in the doorway. Courage personified in a cleaning lady's uniform. Someone with more integrity than both of you combined decided that murder was wrong, even when it meant risking everything to speak up. Ethan followed Richard's gaze to Grace, and his expression twisted with ugly rage. The fucking cleaning lady! You're going to prison because of the fucking cleaning lady! Language, Mr. Brooks, Detective Chen said dryly as she cuffed him. And you're going to prison because you plan to commit murder. Mrs. Donovan just made sure you didn't succeed. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Ethan made one last desperate play. Richard, I can tell you things about your business partners, about deals you've made that weren't exactly legal. Offshore accounts, bribery, tax evasion. Let me walk, and your secrets stay safe. Richard's laugh was genuinely amused. Ethan, I built my fortune legally, transparently, and ethically. If you think attempted murder gives you leverage for blackmail, you're even dumber than I thought. The arrest process was swift and efficient. Isabella and Ethan were read their rights, cuffed and led away in separate police cars while news vans gathered on the street below. The penthouse fell silent except for the distant hum of the city. 50 floors down, Richard found Grace still standing by the door, looking overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Mrs. Donovan, he said softly, thank you. You saved my life tonight. Grace nodded shakily. I just couldn't let it happen, Mr. Caldwell. I couldn't stay quiet and let them hurt you. You risked everything for a man you barely know. That kind of courage is rarer than any fortune I've ever built. As Grace was escorted out by protective agents, Richard stood alone in his empty penthouse, surrounded by the wreckage of his marriage and the silence of justice served. Tomorrow would bring media attention, legal proceedings, and the slow process of rebuilding a life shattered by betrayal. But tonight, he was simply grateful to be alive, thanks to a cleaning lady who chose courage over comfort, truth over safety. 8 months later, Grace Donovan sat in the witness box of the Federal District Court for the Southern District of New York, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from trembling. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Journalists, socialites, curious onlookers drawn by the scandal of a billionaire's wife-turned-murderer. Camera flashes erupted despite the judge's warnings as Grace was sworn in. She wore her best dress, the navy blue one she'd bought for David's funeral 3 years ago. It was modest, respectful, and somehow made her look both vulnerable and unshakable at the same time. Across the aisle, Isabella Caldwell sat between two expensive defense attorneys, her designer suit a stark contrast to the orange jumpsuit she'd worn during pretrial detention. "Mrs. Donovan," Assistant District Attorney Patricia Reynolds began gently, "please tell the court what you witnessed on the night of December 15th. Grace's voice started quietly, but grew stronger as she recounted that fateful night. She described her cleaning routine, the unexpected voices from the conference room, the chilling details of the murder plot. The courtroom was so silent that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. "And what did you do after overhearing this conversation?" "I went home and prayed," Grace said simply. "I asked God what I should do, because I knew Mr. Caldwell was in danger, but I also knew that speaking up could cost me everything." Several jurors nodded with understanding. These were working people, parents, individuals who understood the weight of moral choices when survival was at stake. "What ultimately convinced you to come forward?" Grace's eyes found Richard in the gallery. He gave her an encouraging nod, the same respectful acknowledgement he'd shown her during 5 years of late-night encounters in corporate hallways. "I kept thinking about my own children," Grace said. "If someone was planning to hurt their father, I'd want to know. I'd pray that someone would find the courage to warn me, even if it was difficult." Her voice caught slightly. "My husband died in an accident at work, a real accident. The idea that someone would plan such a thing, would make children orphans on purpose. I couldn't stay silent." The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Jonathan Pierce, who commanded $4,000 an hour, approached for cross-examination with the predatory smile of someone who'd built a career destroying witnesses. "Mrs. Donovan, you work as a cleaning lady. Is that correct?" "I'm a custodial services professional," Grace replied with quiet dignity. "You didn't finish college, did you?" "Objection," Ada Reynolds stood. "Relevance goes to the witness's ability to accurately interpret what she claims to have heard." "Your Honor, I'll allow it, but be careful, Mr. Pierce." Pierce turned back to Grace like a shark scenting blood. "You dropped out of high school to have your first child, correct?" Grace's cheeks reddened, but her voice remained steady. "I got my GED while working 2 jobs and raising 3 children." "Sir, education doesn't always come from a classroom. But you've never been in a courtroom before, have you? Never given testimony in a legal proceeding?" "No, sir." "So you have no experience distinguishing between casual conversation and serious criminal planning, do you?" Grace's spine straightened. This was the moment she'd feared most, being made to feel small, insignificant, unreliable because of her circumstances. "I have experience distinguishing between right and wrong, Mr. Pierce. My mother taught me that before I was old enough to read." A ripple of approval went through the gallery. Pierce's confident smile flickered. "Mrs. Donovan, isn't it true that you were facing financial difficulties at the time of this alleged conversation? Behind on rent? Struggling to feed your children?" "I've never been behind on rent in my life," Grace replied firmly. "And my children have never gone hungry. I work 60 hours a week to make sure of that." But surely the prospect of a reward from a grateful Mr. Caldwell would have been appealing. Grace's eyes flashed with the first real anger she'd shown. "Are you suggesting I made this up for money? I'm suggesting that a desperate single mother might—" "Objection." Ada Reynolds was on her feet. "Counsel is badgering the witness and making assumptions not in evidence." "Sustained, Mr. Pierce. Rephrase your question or move on." Pierce regrouped, but the damage was done. The jury had seen him attack a working mother's character, and their expressions showed what they thought of that strategy. "No further questions," Pierce said curtly. The next phase of testimony came from the FBI surveillance team. Agent Torres presented hours of recorded conversations, financial records showing the defendant's preparations for fleeing the country, and security footage of Ethan tampering with Richard's Mercedes. When Isabella's voice filled the courtroom discussing brake failure and inheritance money, several jurors visibly recoiled. This wasn't passion or desperation. It was cold calculation. Isabella's defense team tried to paint her as an abused wife driven to desperation, but the prosecution's evidence was overwhelming. Text messages showed her planning tropical vacations with Ethan while discussing her husband's upcoming accident. Bank records revealed systematic asset transfers over months, not the panicked actions of a threatened woman. Ethan Brooks testified in his own defense, attempting to portray himself as manipulated by a wealthy, seductive woman. But under cross-examination, his criminal history emerged: military discharge for theft, previous arrests for fraud, a pattern of targeting lonely, wealthy women. "I loved Isabella," he claimed from the witness stand. "Everything I did was for love." Love? Ada Reynolds' voice dripped skepticism. "Is that why you researched non-extradition countries before you even met her? Is that why you had 3 fake passports prepared? Is that why you told your ex-girlfriend in Miami that you'd found the perfect mark?" Ethan's composure cracked under the relentless questioning. By the end of his testimony, even his own lawyers looked defeated. Isabella never took the stand. Her attorneys advised against it. Knowing that her recorded voice plotting her husband's death had already condemned her, the closing arguments were dramatic but predictable. Pierce painted Isabella as a victim of circumstance, trapped in a loveless marriage, seduced by a manipulative ex-soldier. Ada Reynolds countered with the cold facts: months of planning, detailed murder schemes, and the attempted elimination of a witness whose only crime was having a conscience. "This wasn't a crime of passion," Reynolds told the jury. "This was a business plan with murder as the desired outcome. These defendants didn't just plan to kill Richard Caldwell. They planned to profit from his death, to build a new life on the foundation of his grave." The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman was a middle-aged construction worker who reminded Grace of her late husband. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder in the first degree. "How do you find?" "Guilty." Isabella collapsed into her chair as the verdict was read. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched with impotent rage. In the gallery, Grace felt tears of relief streaming down her face. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. Isabella received 18 years in federal prison, eligible for parole in 12. Ethan got 22 years, his longer sentence reflecting his role as the plan's architect and his attempts to intimidate Grace. Judge Margaret Thornton addressed Isabella directly during sentencing. "Mrs. Caldwell, you had every advantage in life: wealth, beauty, education, social position. Instead of using those advantages to build something meaningful, you chose to destroy. Your victim's only crime was treating you with kindness and respect. That you repaid that kindness with murder plans speaks to a moral bankruptcy that no amount of money could ever repair." As Grace left the courthouse, reporters surrounded her with cameras and microphones. "How does it feel to be called a hero?" one shouted. Grace paused on the courthouse steps, thinking of her children waiting at home, of Mr. Caldwell's quiet gratitude, of justice finally served. "I'm not a hero," she said simply. "I'm just a mother who couldn't stay quiet when someone was in danger." Anyone with a conscience would have done the same thing. But as she walked away from the flashing cameras, Grace knew that wasn't true. Conscience was common, but courage was rare. And sometimes, the difference between the two could save a life. 3 weeks after the sentencing, Grace stood in the lobby of Caldwell Enterprises. But this time she wasn't carrying a cleaning cart. Instead, she clutched a manila envelope containing an offer that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Richard Caldwell emerged from the elevator at exactly 9 a.m. Looking more relaxed than she'd seen him in months. The trial had taken its toll. The constant media attention, the public dissection of his private life, the revelation that his marriage had been a lie. But there was something lighter about him now. As if a weight he'd carried for years had finally been lifted. "Mrs. Donovan, thank you for coming." He gestured toward the elevator. "Shall we go up to my office?" Grace nodded, her stomach churning with nervous energy. She'd read his letter a dozen times, but still couldn't quite believe what it proposed. Richard's office looked different in daylight. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the space where Grace had cleaned for 5 years without ever seeing it like this. Warm, welcoming, human, rather than corporate. "Please, sit down." Richard gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "Can I get you some coffee? Water?" "Coffee would be nice. Thank you." Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended, as Richard poured coffee from an elegant service set. Grace studied him with new eyes. The man who had once existed only on the periphery of her working life was now offering to change everything about her future. "I suppose you have questions about my proposal," Richard said, settling into his chair with his own cup. Grace opened the envelope and pulled out the letter she'd memorized. "Mr. Caldwell, this is very generous, but I don't understand why you'd want to hire me. I mean, I appreciate the offer, but I don't have any experience in, what did you call it? Corporate social responsibility. You have something more valuable than experience, Mrs. Donovan. You have integrity. You have the ability to see what's right and act on it, even when it costs you personally." Grace set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "But coordinating charitable programs, managing foundation work. I'm a high school dropout who cleans offices at night. What do I know about running anything?" Richard leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Do you know what I've learned in 20 years of business? Technical skills can be taught. Advanced degrees can be earned. But character, that's something you either have or you don't. And Grace, may I call you Grace? You have more character than anyone I've ever met." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I still don't understand why you'd take such a risk on someone like me." "Someone like you?" Richard's eyebrows rose. "You mean someone who works 2 jobs to support 3 children. Someone who maintains perfect attendance despite having no backup childcare. Someone who treats everyone with respect regardless of their position. Someone who risks everything to do what's right." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city below. "Grace, I've spent my entire career surrounded by people with impressive resumes and expensive educations. Most of them wouldn't cross the street to help a stranger, let alone risk their livelihood to save someone's life. But I don't know anything about foundations or charitable work. Then you'll learn. I'm prepared to pay for you to get whatever education you need. Business administration, nonprofit management, whatever interests you. Columbia has an excellent continuing education program." Grace's breath caught. Columbia University. Her, sitting in classrooms at one of the most prestigious schools in the world. It seemed like a fantasy. "And my children, my current schedule allows me to be home when they get out of school. The foundation position would be standard business hours. You'd be home for dinner, help with homework, attend school plays." Richard turned back to her. "Grace, I'm not just offering you a job. I'm offering you a chance to build something meaningful, to use your experience as a struggling single mother to help other families in similar situations." Grace stared at the letter, reading the salary figure again. It was more than double what she made working nights, enough to move her children to a better neighborhood, to stop worrying about every dollar. What exactly would I be doing? Richard returned to his desk, pulling out a thick folder. "Caldwell Enterprises generates about $50 million in profits annually. I've decided to establish a foundation that will give away 10% of that, $5 million a year, to support working families, single parents, children's education programs." Grace's eyes widened. $5 million. Every year, the foundation would focus on the kind of practical support that makes the difference between families thriving and families just surviving. Child care assistance, emergency financial aid, education scholarships, job training programs. Richard paused. Who better to identify what families really need than someone who's lived it? The magnitude of it overwhelmed Grace. "Mr. Caldwell, I appreciate this more than you know, but I'm not qualified to handle that kind of responsibility." "Grace, look at me." His voice was gentle but firm. "You raised 3 children alone while working 60 hours a week. You've managed budgets tighter than most Fortune 500 companies. You've made life or death decisions under pressure. How is that not qualification enough?" Grace thought about Miguel, struggling with math homework at their kitchen table, about Sophia, reading by streetlight because they couldn't afford a proper lamp for her bedroom, about Carlos, who still sometimes cried for the father he barely remembered. What if I fail? What if I make mistakes and waste money that could have helped people? Then you'll learn from the mistakes and do better next time. Richard smiled. "Grace, I'm not expecting perfection. I'm expecting heart, compassion, and the same moral courage you've already shown. Everything else we'll figure out together." She looked at the letter again, at the official letterhead and formal language that somehow spelled out a complete transformation of her life. From invisible night janitor to foundation director, from struggling to survive to helping others thrive. "How long do I have to decide?" "Take all the time you need. The offer stands indefinitely." Richard paused. But Grace, I hope you'll say yes. Not just because I think you'd be perfect for the role, but because I think you deserve this chance. Grace folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Can I ask you something, Mr. Caldwell? Of course. Why didn't you ever make me feel invisible? In 5 years of cleaning your office, you always acknowledged me, always treated me like a person. Most executives act like the cleaning staff doesn't exist. Richard was quiet for a long moment. My father was a janitor, he said finally. Worked nights at an office building downtown to put me through college. I watched him come home exhausted every morning, watched him take pride in honest work that other people looked down on. He met Grace's eyes. I learned early that a person's worth isn't measured by their job title or bank account. It's measured by how they treat others, especially those who can do nothing for them in return. Grace felt something shift inside her chest, a door opening that she hadn't even realized was closed. This wasn't charity or pity. This was recognition. One human being seeing the value in another. I'll need to talk to my children, she said finally. Of course. And Grace, whatever you decide, you'll always have my gratitude and respect. You saved my life. That's not something I'll ever forget. As Grace rode the subway home to the Bronx, she held the envelope like a precious secret. For the first time in years, the future looked different. Not just survival, but possibility. Not just getting by, but making a difference. She had no way of knowing that this was only the beginning of how much her life was about to change. 3 years later, Grace Donovan Martinez stood at the podium of the Marriott Marquis Ballroom, looking out at an audience of 500 donors, politicians, and business leaders gathered for the annual Hope Foundation Gala. The woman who had once cleaned these same types of events now commanded the room with quiet authority, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. When I was working as a night janitor 3 years ago, Grace began, her words carrying clearly through the microphone. I never imagined I'd be standing here tonight, but that's the beautiful thing about hope. It shows up in the most unexpected places, often when we need it most. In the front row, Richard Caldwell watched with undisguised pride. At 48, he looked younger than he had during his marriage to Isabella, the stress lines around his eyes replaced by laugh lines earned through genuine happiness. Beside him sat Miguel, now 16, and wearing his first tuxedo with the awkward dignity of a teenager trying to look grown up. Sophia, 13 and radiant in a blue dress that matched her mother's, beamed with pride. 7-year-old Carlos fidgeted in his small suit, still young enough to be more interested in the chocolate cake than his mother's speech. The Hope Foundation has had an incredible 3 years, Grace continued. We've provided emergency assistance to over 2,000 families, funded scholarships for 300 students, established 12 community childcare centers, and created job training programs that have helped 500 parents find stable employment. The applause was warm and sustained. Grace had become something of a celebrity in philanthropic circles, the former cleaning lady who had saved a billionaire's life and then used that second chance to transform thousands of other lives. But the real transformation had been in her own family. Miguel was thriving at his new private school, his mathematical struggles a thing of the past with proper tutoring and smaller class sizes. He'd been accepted to Columbia's summer science program and spoke confidently about becoming an engineer like his late father had dreamed of being. Sophia had blossomed into a confident young woman who wrote for her school newspaper and volunteered at the Foundation's community center on weekends. She still read voraciously, but now she had a proper reading light and her own bookshelf filled with classics and contemporary novels. Carlos had adapted to their new life in Westchester with the resilience of childhood. He played Little League baseball and took piano lessons. But more importantly, he'd stopped asking why other kids' daddies came home from work when his never would. The family therapy that Grace's new insurance covered had helped all of them process their grief in healthier ways. None of this would have been possible without the vision and generosity of our founder, Richard Caldwell, Grace said, gesturing toward the front row. But more than that, it wouldn't have been possible without his belief that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when given the opportunity. Richard stood briefly to acknowledge the applause, but his attention was focused on Grace, watching her command that room. Seeing the natural leadership she developed through 3 years of running a major foundation, he felt a familiar warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with pride, and everything to do with something deeper. After the formal program ended, Grace found herself surrounded by donors and board members, but she gracefully extracted herself to join Richard and her children at their table. "Mama, you were amazing," Sophia said, hugging her tightly. "I recorded the whole speech on my phone. Can we get cake now?" Carlos asked, eyeing the dessert table with the single-minded focus of a 10-year-old. "In a minute, baby," Grace laughed, ruffling his hair. The gray streaks in her own hair, which had appeared during the stress of David's death and the trial, now seemed distinguished rather than premature. She'd grown into her role as foundation director with natural grace, her confidence built on the solid foundation of knowing she was exactly where she belonged. "You've outdone yourself tonight," Richard said quietly, as the children dispersed. Miguel to talk with the Columbia admissions officer who'd attended the gala. Sophia to help Carlos navigate the dessert selection. "We've outdone ourselves," Grace corrected. "This foundation is as much your vision as mine." Richard shook his head. "The foundation succeeds because of your heart, Grace. I provided the money, but you provided the soul." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the elegant crowd. So many of these people had initially been skeptical of Richard's decision to hire an uneducated single mother to run a multi-million-dollar foundation. Now, they competed to praise Grace's innovative approaches and measurable results. "Can I tell you something I've never mentioned?" Richard asked suddenly. Grace looked at him curiously. After 3 years of working closely together, first on foundation business and gradually on everything else, she thought she knew most of his thoughts. "Remember that first night you cleaned my office, about 5.5 years ago? Vaguely, you were there late, working on contracts." Richard smiled. "I wasn't really working on contracts. I was hiding from Isabella. We'd had another one of our silent dinners, and I couldn't face going home to more of that suffocating emptiness." He paused. "But when you came in, something changed. You were so genuine, so present, so real. For the first time in months, I remembered what it felt like to have a normal human conversation." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I didn't know. I started staying late more often, hoping you'd be working my floor. Not because I was attracted to you. I mean, not initially, but because you reminded me that authentic people still existed in the world. Richard, I'm not finished." His smile was tender. "I think part of me always knew that Isabella was wrong, but I was too proud, too invested in the image of our perfect marriage to admit it. When you warned me about the murder plot, you weren't just saving my life. You were saving me from a life that was killing me slowly, day by day." Grace's eyes filled with tears. In the 3 years since the trial, their relationship had evolved slowly, naturally, from professional respect to deep friendship, to something that neither of them had dared to name. "The kids adore you," she said softly. "And I adore them. Miguel's like the son I never had. Sophia's brilliant and kind. And Carlos," Richard chuckled. "Carlos asked me last week if I was going to marry his mama." "He did what?" Grace's voice squeaked slightly. "I told him I was working up the courage to ask her." Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Grace Donovan, you saved my life in every way that matters. You showed me what real love looks like. Not the passion of attraction, but the deeper love of truly knowing someone and choosing them every single day." Grace's hands flew to her mouth as Richard dropped to one knee right there in the middle of the gala. 500 witnesses to the most important question of her life. Will you marry me? Will you let me be the father your children deserve and the husband you've always deserved? Through her tears, Grace saw her children watching from across the room, Miguel grinning widely, Sophia jumping up and down with excitement, Carlos pumping his fist in the air and yelling, "Yes, yes, yes," loud enough that half the ballroom turned to look. "Yes," Grace whispered, then louder, "Yes, Richard, yes to all of it," as he slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her. The ballroom erupted in applause, but Grace barely heard it. She was thinking about that night 3 years ago when she'd overheard a murder plot and chosen courage over comfort, truth over safety. The betrayal that should have destroyed Richard had become his redemption. The courage that could have cost Grace everything had given her more than she'd ever dreamed possible. Sometimes, the whisper of truth was worth more than all the silence money could buy.